Hello, so you may have recently watched my video about the Morrigan and her triple aspects, but I wanted to make one more video about her as well in this same sitting, because as soon as I sat down to look at my Morrigan altar, the main thing that stood out to me was that plate with the witch on it, and I thought, how has nobody ever asked me about that? It's a little bit odd, and it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Even though it is very kind of reverential for me too. So I think it's about time that I actually addressed that in some detail. I may have mentioned it at some point, but not really in relation to the Morrigan in any major way, I don't think. I may have touched on this point that I'm going to make in this video, but I didn't go into it in any great depth anyway, and you probably missed it. I think it was in the middle of probably a sound vlog or something. So yes, this plate. First of all, this plate I did not purchase specifically for the Morrigan, about the Morrigan or anything like that. When I was a kid, my dad, because I was born in Sound, which you might have picked up by now, when I was young, when I was a kid, my dad used to make me a birthday card every year with a witch on it that looked remarkably similar to the one you see in front of you, the style of drawing and everything. So he was kind of giving me these cards. I can't remember, I actually don't think it was he himself who drew it. I think it was just like a one of those do you remember those clip art things in Word? Way back in the day, we're talking like Word 98 or something. I think he maybe used to use some clip art from that or something, and it was just this particular witch that he always had in my birthday card. And this, to me, because I had been getting these birthday cards, these Halloween birthday cards, from the age of about 3, this to me was obviously the archetypal witch, and I learned very early on what a witch was. Witches were never hugely scary for me. They were always kind of a figure of empowerment, and I really loved them. They were, you know, I was one of these people one of these kids who from a very young age was absolutely fascinated with witches and really wanted to be a witch. I didn't think that this was possible, but I really wanted to. So as I got a little bit older, when I was maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, those kind of ages, I started to actually make my own witches. I would draw a witch, again, very similar to the one you see in front of you, colour it in, I would cut it out, I would kind of colour both sides, and often I would do them so that if her face was facing you, at the back you could see her hair, that kind of thing. Colour in both sides, hang it on a piece of string, and then there was a room in my parents' house that had a sort of very handy ledge sticking out above the light fixtures. It's got like a glass roof, and I was able to hang them up alongside that so that they kind of flew along the walls, and I would fill the whole room with witches and other things as well, but the focus was really on this massive coven of witches, and every year I would add more and more to my collection. So this figure of the witch on the broomstick flying in the night sky was just one of incredible power and potency for me as a child. It just was this figure of freedom and power, and I hadn't really watched a lot of TV shows or movies with witches in them because I didn't really watch a lot of TV as a kid. I definitely read books, and I think actually most of my exposure to the idea of a witch was in books where we were kind of looking at the witch from a point of view of them being very humanized and not being evil, but the idea of becoming a witch being a very empowering thing, that you were maybe going to an academy for witches. Obviously when Harry Potter came along, it was just sort of an even better version of all these books that I'd been reading as a child anyway, like The Worst Witch and a couple of other series that I absolutely adored. This idea of kind of going to an academy and learning to become a witch, it was, even though I knew that the concept of the witch was generally associated with this kind of evil cackling hag, there was also very much this positive association of empowerment and sovereignty and freedom, being able to get onto this broomstick and fly up into the sky and essentially just kind of do whatever you wanted. I love the image of the witch stirring the cauldron. That was another really powerful one for me, and I used to like make little magic potions in the kitchen. My mum had this amazing spice rack, and I used to basically mix and match all these different spices and mix them up together into this horrible paste in the kitchen. And it was just this sort of idea that you could be a kind of alchemist and draw together these different ingredients, and if you had the know-how, that you could create something, that you could change something, that you could bring something into being. So yeah, it was incredibly powerful for me, and I think it was also one of the major, really powerful female figures that I was exposed to as a child. Now, I mean, my mother, she was a teacher. I knew a lot of incredibly creative and powerful and women who were, you know, very self-actualized and were absolutely not just sort of sitting at home being bored or anything like that. But I would say that the witch was sort of the most powerful female archetype that I encountered as a small child. So, all that being said, what on earth does the witch have to do with the Morrigan? Well, now that I've said all that, you might be starting to see a lot of parallels with the way I feel about the Morrigan. And I think, although it took me a while to make this connection, when I first came across the figure of the Morrigan, she was just, you know, minus the broom and the pointy hat, she was essentially the same figure. You know, she was that same archetype. She had that exact same energy to her for me as that archetype of the witch. She made me feel the same way that I felt when I used to creep down the stairs coming up to Halloween and go into the conservatory with all the witches hanging up, and in the light of the moon. I remember one time looking at the sort of the moon that I'd put up on the wall and the witches flying towards it, and I had this thrill of sort of, there was a bit of fear and apprehension. I was feeling slightly spooked out, this idea of all these witches heading towards the moon, and where were they going and what were they going to do, but there was an incredible feeling of mystery and awe and wonder. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'd say that's something that may have been the earliest form of spiritual kind of feeling that I had as well, which might sound odd, but I was never brought to church as a child. I didn't go to church until I was about 8 years old, and at that point, you know, I just kind of learned about it in school and that kind of thing. So yeah, I loved going out in nature, and nature was always my primary god, but I definitely had that feeling that I've heard a lot of people talk about, of sort of awe and wonderment and possibility when I thought about the figure of the witch. So yeah, that very much ties in with the Morrigan. Another thing I will say is that there is an association for me between the figure of the witch and the figure of Cailleach in Irish and also in Scottish folklore. The word Cailleach came to mean witch in Irish, although it didn't originally. So I am aware that the Cailleach, you know, the figures of Cailleach that appear in this folklore, they're not necessarily a witch, they're not necessarily the same archetype, but there are huge parallels. There are really striking parallels between the figures, and you can kind of see there are these very powerful women, slightly mysterious, very wise kind of women who often are shown to shape the land, and they live on their own, and you know, a very, very, very similar archetype. And I can definitely see how the word Cailleach came to mean witch in Irish. Now the figure of Cailleach, there is no overt association between her and the Morrigan. There are many, many different Cailleachs, Cailleachán, Callie, whatever pluralization you want to make of it, in Ireland and in Scotland, and I don't think it's just one figure. It was just kind of a word that meant woman, really, probably a particular type of woman, maybe a kind of a wise woman, but really just a woman. But at the same time, I feel like all these stories about Cailleach have come together to create this Cailleach archetype. And for me, the Morrigan does actually sit within this greater Cailleach archetype. And when you look at other, and I do actually remember that I did go into this in another video now, because I talked about Baba Yaga and the amazing parallels that you see between her and particularly Baive, but the Morrigan in general. And I feel like the two of them are definitely part of Cailleach. So yeah, this all kind of ties back into my idea of deity as being very multi-layered, and that we have kind of higher layers and lower layers. Not necessarily that that's hierarchical, but that they are kind of, that some contain the rest. That the archetype of the Cailleach contains the archetype of the Morrigan, and the archetype of the Morrigan contains the archetype of Baive and Macha, and so on and so on. And it's just this sort of really fluid and infinite chain or spiral of archetypes and associations. And finally, the Cailleach for me is associated with the Morrigan because this image of the witch is to me the image of Halloween or Samhain and of my birthday. And it's such a magical time for me. It was more mystical than Christmas even for me when I was a child, you know, and really in a lot of ways it still is. And so for me, this image of the witch it's almost like an image of me. And I do see myself reflected in the Morrigan. To a large extent for me, the Morrigan is just a part of myself. She is this very powerful part of my psyche that I am not, you know, that is not fully conscious, that is just this, you know, my power, my personal power, and my muse, and that kind of thing. She is what connects me to the all. She is what connects me to mystery and darkness, and she often acts as my psychopomp into the astral realm. So having a reminder of Samhain, my birthday, this time of year on my Morrigan altar at all times is hugely powerful for me. It definitely gets me into the right mindset to revere her and to be in that place where the Morrigan holds precedence. It just makes sense. So I'll leave it there because my battery in my camera is actually about to die. But I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that clarified things a bit. I do remember now that I did actually go into this a little bit in another video, but you may have missed it. And anyway, I think I've gone into it in more detail this time around. I'm feeling more videos about the Morrigan coming on gradually over time, I think. So yeah, watch this space.